they were able to do voodoo on me. And this is something people have been able to do very easily to me over the years. Because it's like there's psychological warfare in addition to actual warfare, right?
Now, when you say do voodoo, you mean actual voodoo?
Well, we could talk about that, but I mean more loosely, more like psychological warfare, where they can master the way the situation is labeled, and I would believe them. And I wasn't able to necessarily. So they were
crafting the narrative.
Exactly. So they were like, the only reason I cried is because of the ring. You wouldn't have been able to do that if you weren't wearing it. And looking back, it's like, dude, I punched you in the face and you didn't fight back. Like I beat you.
Right.
Like the sissy punched you in the face and you didn't do anything. Right. But you still managed to flip it back on me, and I still went away feeling like I believed them. And my dental office had to communicate. And as I was navigating that process, my dental office assistant it was like she was actively trying to dissuade me from using her services. like if she could blow me off and not have to deal with me for 15 minutes, even though it would cost her, she was going to do that because she was choosing her short term. So she was like not helping me, like actively, like almost gaslighting me. And that's kind of common. And you add in stigma,
right? You
have people, and again, I'm not no one specific. It's more underfunded. You have people front desk. You go in there. They're like, all right, well, you got to come back tomorrow at 7 a.m. Or no, we don't accept your insurance when they do accept. Or we can't help people that don't have insurance. It's like, no, there's a contract there from your local county government office, like the one and they would just blow people off. And these people were shooting heroin, smoking crack, some of them homeless. Nobody's going to listen. Who are they going to call?
Right. They're already downtrodden.
Yeah, and people are going to...
And if somebody doesn't step in to advocate for them, they're fucked.
Exactly. Yeah. But it's like any given day, what I'm faced with and being blessed to walk with some other men on a recovery path is the reality of human suffering. The reality of human limitation. And sometimes if I'm defaulting to just trust God, I'm not being with that person in their suffering. I'm not helping them accept.
It's actually divorcing yourself from taking the path with them. It's actually
100%. 100%. Now, on the other hand, what you have is people that clearly only thing, and this is a fear and trauma response, and this represents the survival mentality that I had. I became a nihilist or a hedonist in my active addiction. I was like, the only thing I understand is strength. That's it.
Right.
I'm going to survive and I'm going to feel good. There's nothing else other than that. And hopefully I die soon because I knew that was a dead-end path.
This is episode 3, episode 12. Okay, so Dancing on a Volcano. This is episode 12, which would also be episode 4, season 2. Nice. We've actually done some of these. That's kind of cool. So, here with Joel Shafer. I get to interview lots of different type of people on the show. And some of them I've gotten to know at a deeper level, and, it was kind of easy to snatch them up, to drag them down here. And the only reason was because, I knew them on a deeper level so I can guilt them into getting them on the show, right? And then there are some that, I've met in passing, and, and there's been some mutual admiration for you and I. I think there's been some of that. There was also once or twice where we kind of butted heads a little bit, and then we worked it out, which I really dig, right? You know what I mean? Like when people... there's something to be said when you're always copacetic and everybody's always cool. And then there's other things to be said where you get to a deeper level of personal development, where you're able to actually see, the reasons why, right? You get a little bit, at least for me, I get my panties in a bunch a little bit. And then I go, oh, wait a minute. Like it's really my low self-esteem and low self-worth, which caused me to... to fluster or to posture or to, you know what I mean? And then I go, oh, wait a minute. And you and I had at least one situation where we both did exactly the same thing. And then afterwards we talked about it and we realized we were both doing exactly the same thing. And then we were like, oh, wait, we're totally cool. And I was like, and from that point forward, I was like, Joel's my boy. You know what I mean? So I was actually really glad that happened, because there was a time in my life where I would have had that level of misunderstanding with an individual, and I just would have carried it forever. And then I saw that person and been like, I don't like them, or, you know, because I harbor some resentment or anger or fear, or, you know, and the dangers of living an unexamined life.
Right.
You know what I mean? Right. And the beautiful thing about, you know, what you and I have gotten to do, you know, at least in part, you know, walking in some similar paths, is, you know, that level of self-examination. And I've watched you personally, you know, and we get to see, you know, explorations on social media and otherwise where we're doing, you know, I watched you, you know, do some really, you know, detailed writing and explorations like that, you know, actually some great stuff. And it was clear that, you know, you were going down the path of trying to sort some things out, you know, and we talked about the meeting before the conversation before the conversation. One of the things we talked about was explorations and creativity. And, you know, and for me, the way I process things has, you know, comes from a creative process. So I respect and admire when other people are trying to sort things out, but they're doing it in a way it's creative, not because it's the only way, but because it's a way I relate to.
Right.
So when I watch somebody, you know, writing or trying to articulate or think things out in that way, you know what I mean? Like I you know, it's something I dig only because it's kind of the way I process things too. So let's talk a little bit about you and your background. So, you know, we won't be breaking nobody's anonymity up in here. You know what I'm saying? So just for the record, okay? But we're both part of 12-step fellowships that we both, and you know, both participate in. And then you have other 12-step fellowships that you participate in as well. And I kind of want to cover some of that with you because I find that interesting. Sure. So you're originally from, you're a Delco kid, but where are you from exactly? Like, let's talk about that.
So I was actually born in Lancaster.
Oh, really? Okay.
In 1977. My father was from outside Dayton, Ohio.
Okay.
So he came from a long line of, they owned farms.
Okay.
Right? So he came from pretty solidly middle class. My mom was from Johnstown, which is mountains, Appalachia.
I've been to Johnstown.
Grandfather coal miner,
right?
That type of thing. Father was German, mother Welsh, Irish, Scottish mix.
Okay.
Scots, very, very strong Scots-Irish, and there's a whole thing about that. I don't want to go off on a tangent, but there's a whole cultural.
We can tangent all we. This is the beauty of this. We can tangent all we want.
Culture going back to.
Right.
Scotland and Ireland.
Okay.
And it's even reflected in some of the stuff that still goes on over there in the Isles. There's a division, like in Northern Ireland, they tend to be more Scots-Irish.
Right.
And some of them moved over to Scotland, then moved back, and then moved back. And it's been this back and forth between Britain as an island and Scotland as part of that island, and then Northern Ireland as being part of Ireland. And it's like there's differences, right? And so they met in Lancaster, and so I lived there till I was 8 years old. And my father had been a welder, right? And so he got retrained when he got laid off. He used some sort of government, I think it was a government program or something to that effect, where they placed him at certain companies. So he got placed at Bell, which is Verizon now, right? And they had an offer to move to Baltimore or to Philadelphia.
Okay.
He was going to become a telecommunications engineer, which is what he became. So then we moved to Upper Darby when I was 8 years old.
It's a huge stretch from Lancaster just proper or whatever.
Well, and here's the thing, and a lot of people don't know this, but Lancaster is a lot like a lot of these northern, like Rust Belt cities, where they have urban centers.
Yes.
That
Lancaster definitely has.
And that's right smack dab in the middle of the urban center.
What, in Lancaster?
In Lancaster.
Right.
So in school, there were a handful of other white people, but among my friends and in my block, I was the only white person.
Right.
There were some white people, older white people that were friends with my parents, but they didn't have kids. So it was Puerto Rican and black who I grew up with until I was 8 years old. And so I came to Upper Darby, and it was Irish, Italian, Catholic, and then some Asians.
Right.
So different types of Eastern Asians and Southern Asians.
Right. Right.
Less so the Southern Asians, but a lot of East Asians. And so there was actually got a little bit of a culture shock because these are, even though both places were like lower middle class, even poor, there were some significant differences. And then also,
well, wait, significant differences. Say more.
So one of the things that was really striking to me, and I don't know if it could have just been I was younger, and so it may have been explained by the fact that I was too young to be exposed to certain things, but like there was like a very high degree of homophobia, like in Upper Darby amongst the Italians and the Irish Catholic kids.
Well, that's kind of, that's a neighborhood thing. It was that way in South Philly. And
and in Lancaster, that didn't come up among the black kids that were my friends. It came up one time, and I went to my mom. I didn't understand, and my parents were hippies, so in her hippie way, she tried to explain to me that sometimes two men are in love and stuff like this. And I'm like, what does that have to do with the word? I don't know if it was punk or sucker or chump. It was one of these three words. And like punk originally referred to the feminine partner and homosexual, the bottom, right? And so I think that's what it was. And there was like a little bit of, there was something behind it that like, I could tell there was force behind it. I didn't understand. It wasn't just I was being called a name. Or someone else was being called a name. I forget what it was. There was innuendo in it, and I was a bright kid in many ways, so I picked up the innuendo, but I couldn't put two and two together. But
you never reference point.
It had never been explained to me. So when I came here, I was immediately pigeonholed as that for a couple reasons. Some of it was I wasn't outrightly masculine in the way that these kids were, even though I had masculine because I grew up. It was rough. I didn't grow up soft, but I didn't carry myself in a way where you would know that. And so, one of the anecdotes that I tell from my first year in Upper Darby at Highland Park Elementary, I had this little red ring. There's a natural history museum in Lancaster, and at the gift shop they sold these, semi-precious stone on a ring. So it was like a little, I don't know, ruby or something like that. Not even a ruby. I don't know. It was more flat than that, but it was on a ring, and I wore it on my index finger, which is not where a boy is supposed to wear a ring. Apparently, I didn't know. My parents were like, "That's okay." It looked. I mean, these things are cultural. But looking back, I can be like, that looks a little fruity. Not that there's anything wrong with that.
But yes. But
I can
get
see
it. Like
where it would tilt.
You were setting yourself up as a target, and unbeknownst to you that you were setting yourself up as a target for ridicule or worse. Or get them. Get them.
And so kids my age, my own size, in my grade, they would come up and they would push and they would push and they would push. And when they finally crossed the line, I would put hands on them because I knew how to do that because I was taught how to do that to some extent. Although my parents discouraged it, and that there was a lot of tension between that behavior and the
protect yourself, but then the hippie cosign.
Whereas like there was this pressure to try to be diplomatic to everybody and be like a saint. Like I was the pressure was on me to be almost an ambassador of like humanism. Right, my parents were humanists. It's like. There's a line, and my mom, I think, didn't even know it was from the Bible, but it's from the Psalms. But she took it, and it wasn't in a religious context, but it says something like, "Come, let us reason together." So it was the idea that any human problems can be worked out through two people talking to each other.
Isn't that wonderful? Except when you're trying to reason with the unreasonable.
Exactly. The space for the unreasonable, there wasn't a space for that in my imagination. Because now my mom acknowledged it, but she was also very ambivalent in facing it. So she had a flamethrower that she would turn on when she had to face the unreasonable, and she would freak out and then feel really guilty. There was no ability to escalate. There was no sense of, like, say, defensive, like force. Like there's an appropriate defensive force. And so there was a lot of ambivalence for me. So that was usually how it happened. I didn't know how to set a boundary or protect myself or even mildly signal to people, hey, leave me alone, which is something that if you're taught that it's okay to defend yourself unequivocally, not without all this extra baggage, and you're taught not to be a martyr, right, and be some sort of hero.
Boy, even for a bright child, it's a lot of mixed. It's a lot to sort through from a mixed signal perspective to try and navigate your way through. I had a lot of difficulty as a child trying to navigate my way through peers.
Exactly.
Home wasn't nearly as much of a challenge, but there was an isolationist aspect to it. But once I got out in the world, I was so ill-equipped for trying to navigate my way through.
And being a creative and a sensitive, which I didn't know about you as much.
Right. In fact, you said something that really struck me. I hadn't thought about this in a long, long time. So, and it kind of ties into this in a weird way. So I've been in art college for a year. I dropped out of art college. I, dated a girl. We moved to South Philly, 1628 South East. It was 8th and Mountain. And we lived together for a while, and then she left me. We split up, and then I was living by myself, and I started hanging out with these South Philly kids. And they all took me in, but I remember like two guys, they both since passed, and I miss them greatly. One, Joe Brown, I miss you, bro, and Damian Vasali, I miss you, bro. They were in my apartment, and in my apartment, the bedroom I had segmented out into two sections. The bed was on one side, and on the other side, I had built out a little mini art studio. So I had like my easel and my art table and all my stuff set up, and I had art out on a table or whatever. And he came over to the place, and we were smoking bones and hanging out or whatever. And then at one point, they were looking at my art studio, and they both looked at me, and then one of me said, "What are you, gay, man?" And I was like, What do you mean? What do you mean gay? No, I'm not gay. Yeah, I'm not gay. And he was like, all right. And I was like, is that what it means if you're an artist that you're gay? And you know what I mean? But you just realize that there's a, societally that we label things, based on, a preconceived notion of what masculinity is supposed to look like. And then frankly, for me at least, as the years have gone on, have kind of like morphed into something that's, probably looks a little bit more masculine than most, just in terms of my behavior and and my interests. You know what I mean? Like, I'm a sportsman. I like to shoot. There's a lot of things I like to do. Those are clearly masculine traits. But in my younger years, you know what I mean? Like, it was just ostracized by my peers. I could never really put my finger on it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Happy-go-lucky or creative, or you know what I mean? And frankly, the thing I was ill-equipped with was, the ability to be able to engage in conflict.
Right.
I didn't have that.
Yeah.
So, it was inconceivable to me at a young age that I could throw hands. Right. So, but it's interesting to me, you know what I mean? Like how difficult it is at a young age to navigate our way through the signals we get from two different places simultaneously. The one that we get from the household, and our parents are equipped to do the best they can based on their understanding of the world, and also at the same time, their need to try and protect their children.
Yeah.
Like you want to teach them, right? But you also, you want to teach your children and you want to equip them.
Yeah.
And some of the things you want to equip them for are things that ultimately you don't want to teach them. You talked about that.
Right.
Like you don't want to teach them how to throw hands, but at the same time, if they don't have that as a skill set, then when the day comes when they need it, better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it, right? So now, here you are, right? You moved from Lancaster to Delco, right? You're living in Derby. Right, Upper Darby, which it's not the neighborhood now that it was in those years. I don't believe, like not, like everything from the city over time.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Upper Darby's more like West Philly now.
Yes,
But
exactly.
it was very segregated back then.
Yes, and South Philly was the same way.
Yeah.
Like South Philly in 1987 was predominantly Italian with some Irish, and then there were outskirts that were Asian and black or whatever. Now most of those communities are Spanish, right? And mostly Mexican Spanish or immigrant Spanish, and Asian. A lot of the areas where I, spent my younger years, they don't look the same anymore.
Yeah.
Those communities have branched out and And like you said, like Upper Darby's a lot like West Philly. I got news. When I lived in Drexel Hill, I could feel being on the borderline.
Yeah.
And frankly, I didn't really feel that way until the riots.
Yeah.
And then because there was a point where, so I have a police radio in my, and you know, post-traumatic stress disorder kicks my ass from time to time. And when they were rioting, I went upstairs and kicked on my police radio. And I could hear him saying, you know what I mean? And I had the shotgun by the door and I had the 45 on the table and I, you know what I mean? Because I was like, the whole world felt like it was coming unglued.
It did.
And the cell phone store down the, and I live in a pretty decent neighborhood, and there was a cell phone store down the street from my house, and it was like they boarded up all the windows and shit. And I was like, oh man. I turned on the radio and they were up on Giant on State Road. And you could hear the police talking, and they were like, glass breaking Kohl's, which was a mile walk from me.
Right.
And then they were like, glass breaking Lowe's, which was next to Kohl's.
Right.
And I was like, and I also noticed that they weren't responding for fear that if they were to have an altercation with somebody that caused, you know, a shooting, it would have just, so they just basically had to let people do what the hell they were going to do. Yeah. They had to just stand by and let people loot because they couldn't afford the consequences of catching somebody. And then they said something to the effect of there was a troop of kids that were going around carjacking people. And that's when I was like, you know what I mean? I was like, it's about to go down, right? And I was just like, and that was one of the reasons why, when the time came to move, why I pushed further out into more rural, because I was just like, to me, I was like, I felt like that there was a time and place in this world where we were going to come back to that again.
Yeah.
And when it did happen, I wanted to be in a place that was not on the border or on the edge of. I didn't want to be in the middle of. It didn't do well for me because I would be the kind of guy that would end up in an altercation and, putting a hole in somebody.
Yeah.
And then, and then I'm standing tall in front of the man and, what I mean? And I didn't. So, wow. So, I've watched some of the things that, that you've been sorting out. You and I have had some conversations behind the scenes about some things that you were also, we talked about this beforehand, the Musashi quote that, there are more than one way to the top of the mountain.
Yeah.
Right. And we're both 12-step members, so we're both part of a fellowship and a process where we get to, a deeper level of exploration about us, and we get to work on us. But I've also known from you, and not in detail, but you'd also, in the interest of trying to, dig deeper to get to the core of some of the challenges that you were facing, chose to explore other processes as well. So can we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so to kind of go back to the anecdote about I was wearing that red ring, third grade, Highland Park Elementary, 1985, and there were 3 different instances where kids crossed the line where they started to put their hands on me, right? And 3 different times I hit them in the face, and because of where the ring was positioned, it ran into their eye,
right? And
they cried.
Mm-hmm.
And this is funny because they were able to do voodoo on me, and this is something people have been able to do very easily to me over the years. Because it's like there's there's warfare in addition to actual warfare, right?
Now, when you say do voodoo, you mean actual voodoo?
Well, we could talk about that, but I mean more loosely, more like psychological warfare, where they can master the way the situation is labeled, and I would believe them. And I wasn't able to necessarily. So they were crafting
the narrative.
Exactly. So they were like, the only reason I cried is because of the ring. You wouldn't have been able to do that if you weren't wearing it. And looking back, it's like, dude, I punched you in the face and you didn't fight back. Like, I beat you.
Right.
Like the sissy, the pussy, the faggot punched you in the face and you didn't do anything.
Right.
But you still managed to flip it back on me, and I still went away feeling like I believed them. Because I didn't know how to own that. I felt uncomfortable owning that. I feel uncomfortable even saying that now, like I'm trying to act like I'm a tough guy. I'm saying by their standards, I won.
Right.
By their third grade, lower middle class standards, I won that little war on that stage of, like, right now it's silly. I wish it would never happen. And thankfully schools are a lot safer than that. Although something did happen to me last week, and maybe this is the way to talk about the other ways I've explored issues. So, all right, so I'll give a little bit about what was going on in my home and then what was happening outside the home, right? So in the home, in addition to my parents being kind of hippies and embracing these values for maybe less than, they didn't know why they were embracing those values. Like in some ways they were maybe trying to avoid certain things. Like for my father, it was very easy to fall back on his politics and his ideology to justify him not climbing any kind of success ladder. He wasn't really interested in that. It scared him. So he can be like, well, I don't want to climb that ladder because to climb that ladder would put me in a position to be, in his terms, exploitative to people, because he had that like Karl Marx stuff going on. Right. And he ended up being a manager. He wanted to stay a worker, right? He had gone to college, was a very bright person, really into books and ideas, sort of like how I became. But he kind of gave that all up and became a blue-collar person, very intentionally and deliberately. My mom, and I really think almost 95% of the addiction and mental health issues out there can really be, I mean, the details vary from person to person, and there's genetics and there's stuff like that, but I really think it all really goes down to childhood development and teenage human development, right? Right. Learning, like we were talking about. Mm-hmm. And something happened to my mom, or she was born in a certain way, or a little bit of both. Right. We're not sure. We think maybe she had been on the spectrum, and they didn't have, it wasn't like she was poor. She could function, so she would be considered
highly functional.
Yeah, more like Asperger's. Right. Okay. Or there could have been some sort of childhood trauma that froze her developmentally. But what ended up happening was she had no real ability to control her physiology and her emotions, which go hand in hand. Right. And that sounds a lot like Asperger's. Right. Mm-hmm. But certain types of trauma also cause that, unfortunately. But they didn't. But in those years, there was no Yeah. The therapies that were available were considered cognitive. So you tried from up here. Now you did have some Freudian stuff where they could go deeper, where you would get into analysis, but they didn't have the language of physiology about fight or flight, about trauma, and the way they hadn't mapped out the mind and the body as this whole perceptual mechanism. Wasn't what we are now. Exactly. So she wasn't availed the right thing. So what she found herself in a position, you can't regulate your emotions. I always say this. I think good 90% of success in life is, you can call it people skills, but people skills, if you really go a little lower underneath that, it's really that ability to regulate your emotions. It's emotional intelligence. Exactly. And if you don't have some level of emotional intelligence, which is really emotional awareness, then you're apt to, fly off the handle or, sure. And then she had these really powerful ethics, which were really good. But again, she led with those things almost like it was like she was self-sabotaging, and she had a flamethrower. Now, to her credit, everywhere she went, she was what's the word? I'm drawing a blank on the word, but she was a crusader, right? But she stood up against powerful people in very strategic ways for people she was a nurse for many years. And she would stand up for the underdog, for children, for patients, for women. And all these things were real, but it also came at this tremendous cost to her and the people around her. Right. And then including me. And then in the household, it was like, and I didn't realize this until like a couple years ago. She was upset all the time. Right. And we don't know what it's like to be in other households, except from a slight glimpse from time to time. Yeah, right. I went over, and we played Nintendo. Exactly. Or what I mean. And I had I had spaghetti at Tommy's house, or what I mean. Like but you never really, you just got glimpses of that. You never really, and frankly, you talked about something that's actually really, I think, important to the conversation, because a lot of this really has to do with. You talked about the conflict on the schoolyard. Yeah. And then the win,
right? We always quantify the win based on physically what happened.
Right.
And what we're learning, we're seeing it now play out in socio-political arenas and otherwise, that the winning is really associated by ultimately who controls the narrative.
Exactly.
And we'd like to say the narrative is, they like to say the narrative is controlled by the winners, but not necessarily. More often than not it is. But people could quantifiably be losing, but have the ability to be able to spin the narrative in a way where ultimately, even though they lost, they win.
Yes.
Right. And, and what you talk about is, how you're experiencing that as a child with your peers, and you're also experiencing that in some ways with the words and the music not necessarily matching with regards to what's going on in the household, right? Because, your mom's crusading, right? You know what I mean? But also simultaneously, you're trying to get your feet firmly planted on what is our message, and then the messages are mixed somewhat, right? So, and then at the same time, so how does this all really interface between, so you have you and your mother, how does this really interface between you and your father and between your father and your mother? Like, what are those dynamics like?
So my mother was basically operating at like maybe a 10-year-old level in terms of her ability to navigate.
You mean
emotionally and physiologically, right? And so,
but she sounds like she was intelligent by all stretches,
and she was hyper responsible,
right?
So she was given the reins of the household. Now, some of it was she wanted that. So in my father's defense, he could. They're both passed, by the way, but he could, while he was alive, say, hey, she would have fought me on this. So I had to give her control. However, it was also very convenient to him because he had what you would call an avoidant personality.
Right.
So he wanted to check out. He was emotionally avoidant. Mm-hmm. He wanted to, he would pursue low-level pleasures. He wasn't necessarily an addict, but he was constantly wanting to check out. He did not want to be in reality. Reality was painful for him, and he found a way to shut down. And so he really operated at the sophistication of a teenager in many ways.
Right.
And so you have this woman who is really at her core a child, but she's being forced into an adult role and dual adult roles to be both the father and the mother.
And looking for the most part. You talked about, at least in part, social responsibility. Wants to fight for the, the downtrodden.
Yeah.
Right. Hyper responsible.
Yeah.
Like all the things that look outwardly,
exactly,
right, very, very, well put together.
Yeah.
But with an emotional development that's far underdeveloped and gives you the inability to be able to navigate your way through social situations and relationships and otherwise, which leads me to a thought, and that thought is, so we talk about that the first time, and it's whether or not it comes from the literature, I don't know for sure, but I do, believe that it's true that, that our emotional growth gets stunted at the time when we start using, because it's an escapist move that we make. And when we make that escapist move, to avoid pain, it's pain that causes us to mature, right? And when we go through that avoidance from pain, then we don't mature.
We don't have volcanoes that we can, healthy volcanoes, dance around.
Fucking right.
So we can learn how to dance.
Fucking right. Exactly. So now, one thought is that for you specifically, right? You know what I mean? Because I do believe that, what age did you first use?
It wasn't until almost 17.
Okay.
Almost 17.
But at the same time, the example that you had, at least household example, of emotional intelligence was from an avoidant father, and from a mother with childlike qualities that we call maybe high functioning borderline Asperger's or whatever. So as children, we model what we see to the best of our ability. So you've got to think that, at least in part, it explains a lot about your journey to me. You know what I mean? Like
That's great.
I get more of you now, because now, I see, I've talked about this before on the show, right? That it wasn't until later in my life that I started to develop an avatar, right? The avatar is the in the Matrix, right? You know what I mean?
Like persona is
the persona, the outward persona
Yeah.
that basically is the forward-looking projection of internally who I would like others to believe that I am, but not actually me.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, I'm Keanu Reeves outside of the Matrix eating oatmeal with a big port in the back of my head in the Nebuchadnezzar. You know what I mean? Like riding around in this little ship or whatever in an arena that's uncomfortable and unsafe and all these other things. But when he jacked me into the Matrix, I'm cool with sunglasses and guns and long leather overcoat, right? You know what I mean? Like the avatar of, right? You know what I mean? And I think for those of us, because like you, for me, in a lot of ways, emotionally underdeveloped, not for necessarily exactly the same reasons, but can very, very much identify.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes the more extreme outward appearance of that avatar is based on more of an inward uncomfortability from where I am internally, right? You know what I mean? So
they call that overcompensation in classic psychological terminology.
Right. You know what I mean? And, what you find as you get older is that, the people that hate homosexuals the most are homosexuals themselves or, right? You know what I mean? Like, and you start to see all these things. So,
or real quick, or are otherwise have some sort of what they perceive to be a weakness that they conflate with homosexuality. So they might not even be gay, but they're scared or they have emotions. They've been taught that's gay.
Yeah, right.
Or they want to be an artist and they're taught they're gay.
Right.
They paint it by themselves in their room and they're ashamed of it.
It comes back to, like this conversation clearly has taken a direction of narrative.
Exactly.
Right? And, and you said, man, this is, wow. So, all right, so the volcano, right? And the dance, because you just mentioned both of those.
Yeah.
Right? And we talked about emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
Right? And one of the gifts of change, right? And the ability to live and examine life is the ability to be able to dispose of, to dig deep enough to get to the core of the reasons why, where the low self-esteem and the low self-worth and the discomfort and the dis-ease and all these other things really come from, so that I can start to craft, because frankly, there is no world I can live in where there's not going to be an avatar that will exist of me.
Right.
Right. You know what I mean? Like I'm responsible in family and in business and in recovery and in all these other areas to put forth basically a representation of myself. And although I'd like to be as authentic and try and be as authentic as possible, like you're not just going to walk into me in my pure authenticity right out of the gate.
Yeah.
Right. So, but the neat thing about, and this is what we talked about, you know what I mean? Like we talked about the dance.
Yeah.
Right. And we've explored all different types of dances here on the show, but another type of dance we never really explored was the dance to authenticity, right? That comes from being able to craft a narrative, both how we deal with the outside world, how we deal with ourselves internally, and how we deal with the past.
Exactly.
Because frankly, I've come to find through deeper exploration that a lot of the narratives that I had crafted for myself to be able to deal with my experiences of my past weren't necessarily dialed into exactly what happened in my past. Right. And then once I started digging deeper, I started realizing that I had crafted false narratives.
Absolutely.
Right. And then once I started to look at what had actually really happened, I went, wait a minute. Like, once I got to a clearer picture of what had actually happened, then the narrative no longer really made sense. And I had to craft these new narratives that were in better alignment to what better served the memory to the best of my ability of what my reality during those years actually was. It's humbling, right? Can be, in fact, humiliating and has been for me sometimes.
Yeah.
But one of the biggest dances, right? You know, one of the best dances is to be able to leverage the creativity that I do have to rewrite that narrative that's not only serves my way of viewing the world, my view of potentially what the future will be and dealing with the past, but also expresses a level of creativity in the way that I craft that narrative, because I can actually, thoughts are things, what we say comes to pass, right? So not always, of course, but the point of the matter is that through leveraging a better understanding of my past and my history, and then also leveraging some creativity and having the courage to be able to, shit, what is this, bro? Right. You know what I mean? Like, this is an opportunity to explore in a way that, you know, requires some level of vulnerability, being creative but vulnerable at the same time. You know what I mean? Like, and so, like, good examples of that is, like, I've watched you write, right? And your writing's pretty interesting. Like, you know what I mean? Like, sometimes I think, you know, deeper into reality of truth of your past, and then sometimes, you know, what's that, you know, in the interest of omitting people to protect their right, you know, I've seen some of that too, like, you know, we've changed the names to protect the innocent. Absolutely. Right, you know what I mean? But I mean, so let's talk a little bit about recovery. So I think let's pull on that thread that you were talking about. Please. With the narratives and the avatars. Right. And I think that will help diagnose what the problem was for me that led to the say more. Yeah, say more. And then led to recovery. So interesting thing has been over the years, you know, the low self-esteem narrative, right? Mm-hmm. Often people have suggested to me, and it makes sense. I mean, if you looked at my behavior, often I was overcompensating. I was trying to prove a point. Me too, bro. But deep down, I was afraid. I was afraid of any kind of success. I was afraid of failure. I was so fear-driven. You would think that consciously, underneath it all, that mentally, I would have all sorts of beliefs about myself that were really, you're not good enough. But the interesting thing was that over the years, I had crafted such powerful defenses against that it wasn't up here. I did not think those things, and even subconsciously didn't think those things, but my body had a different response. And I'll explain it this way. So in my household, mother's always upset, and her go-to was, I'm going to say this carefully, and for people that aren't familiar with the language, it can sound kind of strong, but it is more of a technical term. She was emotionally, and I have to underline emotionally incestuous. Emotional. That's. I just right. No, there was no real incest. Yeah, right. But what happened was she learned to temporarily calm her out of control physiology through her relationship with me, and both directly and indirectly. And what that did, there's another technical term. It's called parentifying. So she was making me her equal, and so she was kind of making me, like, I was filling the gaps that she wasn't letting my father fill, or he wasn't able to, or both. Right. And the amount of pressure that put on a small child to make but the thing about it, it was like she could never, from an external person, place, or thing, ever be fixed. So she was constantly chasing it. But it was like you were saying, and this is what happens with the drug, the more she chased relief, the more the monster that was behind her grew in power. And that goes down to the level of our neurons and our immune system. Like, the more that she reacted with this powerful defensive move to try to fix how she felt, the more that her body was given the signal that she was in danger. So let's talk. Yeah. Let's dig deeper on. You use the term pull thread, and one of my closest friends, he uses that term all the time too, to the point where I use it from time to time. Yeah, I like it. So you talked about how. All right, so. And I like the term emotionally incestuous, and I understand exactly what you mean by that, right? You know, and you also talked about the onus and the burden that comes to a young child from, you know, being an emotional equal with a parent that's supposed to be raising them. So how does that manifest in the household is question number one. Like,
Yeah.
how does that transpire in a way is it a dialogue? And then how does that manifest itself in terms of then how you participate in the world around you? Because that's a heavy trip to carry with you out, then trying to navigate your way through your peers,
Absolutely.
being crafted as an adult while still having a child mindset. Like, so how does that happen? What's that feel like in the home? What's that look like? Paint a picture.
So when I was smaller, between the ages of obviously being born and maybe like 6 or 7, and actually it corresponds pretty neatly to the move. So probably back in Lancaster when we moved, like before I turned 8 and we moved to Upper Darby, to Delco, that was the stage where I don't remember the specifics, but I guarantee you what would happen a lot of times is mommy would be upset and little Joel could go cuddle with mommy, and mommy could otherwise distract herself by taking care of little Joel's needs, and she would temporarily be her physiology would temporarily stabilize.
Right.
And so it would be the whole business of the love and affection, literally me being attached to her hip, and then her taking. But one of the things she did is she took, like, I didn't speak till I was 3 years old. They thought I might have some sort. This was late enough that they had started to talk about like autism.
Right, autism.
But my mom was born in the 50s, so they didn't really have that. But by the 80s, they were sort of starting to talk about. They were worried. She was worried because my mom was brilliant. She researched before the internet. She had as much information as most doctors. I don't know where she got it from.
Right.
Because we didn't have money, but she was a genius level in terms of abstract information. But and I think it may have been a pediatrician or may have been a specialist, but some sort of professional doctor said to my mom, she said, Sharon, the reason why Joel isn't talking is because you provide him his every need. You have not incentivized him to talk, to actually ask for something. So that was a picture of how closely she was simultaneously, as she parentified me, she was infantilizing me simultaneously. And this is an exploitative move from an addict. Let's call it an addict personality that
just doesn't manifest itself with use of drugs or alcohol.
And she was seeing me as an object. She was not seeing me as a person. She didn't see me as having my own independent needs and desires. So by the time I'm 8 or 9, she can no longer get that kind of really quick fix.
There's no cuddle in
there
it
isn't
anymore.
as much
not as a 9.
Although I slept in her bed till I was around 8.
Right.
And I don't know where my dad was. And we lived in small places.
Not participating.
Exactly.
Clearly.
So what was not happening, what was not happening was they weren't connecting probably the way that, and later, and
she was probably manifesting what was missing in her relationship with your father in intimacy with you, although not physical.
Exactly.
In nature, emotionally connecting with you in a way that probably wasn't healthy for your development.
Exactly. And they were not consummating that. And I should have never known about this, but somehow they didn't keep their voices down, or they may have actually at some point directly let it be known that they were not having sex. Right.
So
which is inappropriate as well.
You know what? So my first thought is, although there are some differences, there are a lot of similarities in the way that we grew up. Now, I'm not going to say that my father was avoidant. You know what I mean? Like, he was ultimately uber responsible and a hell of a provider.
Yeah.
But the after effect of that, and he was type 1 diabetic, right? So he worked. When he told him he was type 1 diabetic in his early 20s, he basically tried to cram 3 lives into one. Now, he was involved in our lives, and, I would never want to say he wasn't a fantastic human being, but it was also in the interest of being a provider and, breadwinner for the family. Not home a lot of the time in the early years. And, and I was an only child till 10. So when I got to school, like grade school even, right? And there was clearly there was a hierarchical pecking order that was existing between children. Like, you know what I mean? It's a natural part of, the biological and sociological process, right? But it's also inherently very cruel. And for me, I was ill-equipped. And
Right.
what I understand now is a lot of the reason why I was ill-equipped was because a lot of those children were coming from households where that social and hierarchical process was happening in the home, right? So older brother was beating up on younger brother, and older sister was beating up on younger sister, and you know what I mean? So they were better prepared. They had the gift of momentum.
Yeah.
You know, by kindergarten when they arrived,
Yeah.
you know, they were ready to, you know, use those same processes in
They were trained.
sociology with the other children that I was ill-equipped for. And the pattern that you and I are talking about, even though there's differences, there are some similarities.
Yeah.
And then I just thought of like Pink Floyd's The Wall, right? Mother's going to help you build the wall.
Exactly.
Right? You know what I mean?
That
and
song
how,
brings tears to my eyes.
yeah. And thinking to myself, like, how much more common this probably is, right? For, you know what I mean? Especially for children, you know, of the, you know, 50s, 60s, 70s, maybe even into the 80s.
Yeah.
Right? Of, you know, a lack of awareness about psychology, biology, you know what I mean? Like all these things that are starting to come to light in this last 20 years.
Yeah.
Right? You know, these different understandings about, you know, the human brain and how we're wired, and, you know, different visions of psychology. Like you talked about, like that therapist that I had in here, Brendan Wyndon Rowe, that was here a couple weeks ago, was talking about, you know, some things that had to do with Freud and that type of thing. And she said, but our viewpoints have evolved since then.
Right.
We don't look at those things the same way as we did then. Like that's actually, and you think like that, you know, those were the forefathers that for all intents and purposes were what, you know,
They were the state of the art.
Yes, of their time.
Best you could get.
And then today they're looked at as, well, we know more now.
Exactly.
Right? So, you know, but I think to myself, how many of us, right, that danced on the edge of the fucking volcano, or actually stood on the edge of the volcano before we actually ever knew to dance? And how much of that, how much commonality is there for so many of us?
Right.
That have similar stories, right? That in the end, in the interest of controlling the narrative, swept it under the fucking rug so nobody would ever know. So we all arrived to the same place, you know what I mean? Like, you know, I say all, but, you know, when I say all, I mean people with common paths of, you know, substance abuse history and those type of things. You know, we arrive with the gift of desperation, right? And we were all like, immediately like got the gloves up, like, you don't have my background,
right? You're
not like me,
right?
You know what I mean? Like you can't possibly fucking understand. And then the more we peel back, you know, the more I come to realize how much commonality there really is in a lot of our stories, and where the roots of those stories really come from. And you start to see the brilliance of Mama's going to help build the wall. Right? You know what I mean? Like, because, you know, I remember when I was, you know, eating a lot of shrooms and smoking a lot of weed and doing a lot of drugs and being like, oh, this is really cool, watching that movie, and having the underlying meaning of it, it escaped me at a level that I see now more, like what they were really trying to say.
Right. I feel like I want to put a little bit of a caveat on some of this thread, right? Particularly about talking about my parents. So a lot of people will use the phrase, they did the best they could. And I'm trying to find, I don't agree with that statement, at least not for me.
Okay.
However, there's something that would be more precise. Okay. That would do better justice. That would be something, you know, you're a businessman, you're familiar with trade-offs. There's trade-offs to everything, right?
Right.
So they did a lot of good. Let's put it that way. And another way to also frame this that is charitable to everybody, but also doesn't shift unfairly responsibility away from myself, is some of these same dynamics I've repeated with my own daughter.
Sure.
Right?
Absolutely.
And in the beginning of the conversation, we talked about Scots-Irish.
Me too, by the way.
Yeah, Scots-Irish. You know, I can look at that identity that comes, these were mountainous people. right? And they lived in the hills, and they were like, "Leave me alone, Flatlanders.
Right.
You come up this hill, I have the higher ground.
Right.
We're gonna throw stones at you. Leave us alone with your fancy stuff. We're simple people. Leave us alone. For better or worse, that was also channeled. So it's like, I don't know which came first, these causation, correlation, but my mom was a fighter. Tony Robbins talks about, he says, if your main, what's the word, might be persona or avatar or your main impetus, you can define it in a certain role. And he says, if you're a dancer, you're going to see everything as a dance, right?
Yeah,
if you're a fighter, everything's going to be a battle. And that was my mother, for better or worse.
Right.
And so what happened by the time I was 8 in the household was there was a more elaborate ritual that was constructed in order to basically help my mother self-medicate or medicate.
Right.
And it was, she would throw essentially a grown-up fit, and we would have to stop everything, me, my sister, and my father. And we were all forced to have our physiology going towards fight or flight. We were not entitled to our own space and peace and boundaries. And everybody had to be freaked out as long as it took for her to stabilize. And it was sort of like, ever watch this dynamic? I had it happen with girlfriends I've had, where it's almost like people get addicted to fighting because of the makeup sex. It was like a similar, she got addicted to throwing a fit because then she would trick her system. She would trick her, it was control, but she would trick her system into like spitting out all this cortisol. And then what happens is the body will send some endorphins, some other, as you calm down. So rather than her going to trying to seek peace for herself, her way to peace was, and this is a PTSD thing.
Right.
This is a whole phenomenon that Bessel van der Kolk, who's like basically the godfather of the modern trauma lexicon. Like he basically almost single-handedly popularized that term. He studied Vietnam vets in Boston in the 70s. And it in some ways, what it can be boiled down to is that often people with this kind of trauma feel safe when they're unsafe. It's so because there's these games that have to be played with their system. So these vets that he studied, they felt safest when they were fighting with their girlfriends, when they were reminiscing with their war buddies. In other words, they were triggering each other by going back, riding their motorcycles in dangerous ways, using substances in dangerous ways. That's when they felt the most safe.
Right.
The least safe is when, and it makes sense from a biological, physiological standpoint, the least safe they felt was when they were calm, because if you believe that the storm is inevitable, your system is telling you why you might as well just ramp up.
Right.
What you should
the calm is in fact the signal for the storm.
Exactly.
Right.
And my mom got into that cycle. Not 100% the same, but she was in the same cycle. And so and again, this like you were saying, and this is in no way intended to kind of give myself a pass for anything I ever did. This is in no way tries to inform me, victim. It's more, my intention in talking about these things is to explore in a very rational way what happens to human beings and why they, like, what incentivizes them, like and so to kind of fast forward, what happened was, so I was trained to take care of other people's feelings, right? And I was also trained that I had to be ready to fight all the time,
right?
And so I'd be out in the world and it'd be like, I'd be trying to make friends with you so you wouldn't hurt me. But if you also, that wasn't good enough, then I reserved the right to pick up a rock and hit you with it.
Right.
And so I was constantly dysregulated. And so by the time I'm 15 years old, I've assembled all this misfit crew around me.
Right.
And I'm also like my mom, I'm trying to be the smartest person you could ever be because I got put in that role, but there was a little bit of power in that role. Right. And it represent control and power over my environment. Like if I had to be the nerd, I'll be the nerd, but I'll be the nerdiest nerd. Right.
Right.
But I also wasn't really a classic nerd. Like I like to play sports. Like me and my friends, I started listening to rap music. Like I was butch in many ways, like for lack of a better term, like macho. Like I was attracted to macho things, but I was also had my sensitive side. I like to read and I was sensitive, but I was constantly hypervigilant and dysregulated. And I took on these roles in order to protect myself. And I had and it just happened earlier as we were talking about these things, like in my gut, I can feel like I'm talking about my parents. I love them, right? I miss them. My mom died in 2019, didn't find out until 2022 when my dad died. So my dad died 2022. We found out she had been gone 3 years. So essentially I lost them both the same year.
Wow.
Right.
Okay.
And I've been working on this stuff very directly too for the last, like very powerfully for the last year. So instantly, like I feel it in my gut. And then we're talking about things like related to, all this stuff goes right. It still resonates. So I was telling you the story how I won. I said I won in that battle in third grade. That I had a strong emotional reaction because I'm like, someone watching this is it's almost like they're gonna call me on that, and I'm gonna have to fight them. And at the same time, I'm like, someone else will think you're corny or they're gonna think they're gonna criticize it from a different value, like why are you being macho, right? Like, and so there's all these value collisions still going on that represent like a pull in my body. But the thing I don't know how to do is recognize, like, I've become the king, the master of avoiding or somehow avoiding these feelings rather than just feeling them. And so I felt, I'm like, oh, because I've been being taught, I felt it. I'm like, oh, maybe you can calm. Maybe you can turn. Maybe you can go the other way. Maybe you don't. And you can see what I want to do. What I want to do is get hyperverbal.
Right.
And I'm good at it.
Right.
And we both are. Like, I can go off on this tangent. I think I'm doing pretty well. Like, I'm on a roll. I'm in the zone. Like, I'm pulling a bunch of different things
That's
together.
the idea, bro.
Right? And that makes for a good conversation. But it represents that same energy.
Right.
Because I'm trying to either fight whatever's causing me that emotional pain, or I'm trying to run away from it, or a little bit of both. Like I'm trying to do judo around it because it just hurts. It just hurts, and I don't know what I'm supposed to do with that pain. Because what happened with my mom was, no matter what we did, it was never good enough. She got worse over time, and that's how I felt with the neighborhood. It was like, if I fought people and hurt them, I could go to jail or get in trouble, and my parents would be upset with me because I was violent and I had hurt somebody, and I would feel guilty. But if I didn't fight, then I would get punked and I would be humiliated and I'd be physically hurt.
So it's the quintessential no-win psychologically.
I couldn't win. And then I found drugs, and I found the whole lifestyle. I was like, I thought I could opt out. I thought I just won't listen to your values or your values. And what I began on was the self-esteem thing. My body underneath in a novel situation signals to me that I'm out of my depth. So my body has low self-esteem. In my mind, I'm like, I can figure this out. Like, just show up. Like, I have all the information. It's like all the common sense, like all the common sense things they tell you with a job interview, let's say. Like, that's like a good framework for most novel social interactions. And those are the things that are most challenging for me. I know what to do, but my body's like, no, you don't. Well, no, you don't.
So there's a really cool thing because the correlation between body and mind.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then there's different levels of mind.
Yeah.
Right. There's the external mind, the developed mind, the thinking mind, the emotion. Then there's that deeper level of the cerebrum, the inner mind. You know what I mean? Which is where the subconscious mind lies, and the mind, the brain is part of the body, right? You know what I mean? But there are different levels of it, and as you get down to the core, it becomes more, that function is part of bodily function. Like, for example, breathing is not something I decide to do. It's something it's done for me, right? So there are clearly some involuntary responses that are happening underneath, right? You know what I mean? Exactly. And so, and I think sometimes, like when it comes to, because I can relate a lot to what you said, and what I relate to is that the difference between intellectualizing, right, and a deeper level of knowing that's at the core rests with the subconscious, right, and coming from parents who were both hypnotists. So my mother and father were both hypnotists.
Interesting.
So I mentioned that on the last show too. They had Dinardo and Dinardo hypnotherapy in Lafayette Hill growing up. So. And my father was president of Hypnosis Union Local 476 in Philadelphia. They had a union. So hypnosis unit. So, but I've always felt that, I've never taken light the power of the subconscious, although I never really, had it. I'd like to say that growing up, I had a deep level of awareness. I just the fact that I knew that a subconscious existed,
right?
You know what I mean, was far above and beyond what most people had awareness of around me.
Yeah.
But more and more as time goes on, I start to see really that a lot of, what was controlling things had very little to do with my conscious mind. Right. You know what I mean? Which is part of the challenges that I had early in recovery, frankly. Because like you, I started using around the same time, plus or minus. I mean, I was in mom and dad's liquor cabinet, maybe 13. And between 13 and 17, it started to progress. But I left to go to college at 17. And I went to art college. And as soon as I got to art college, it was like our professional sports team was getting high.
Right.
You know what I mean? It was that there was no basketball or football. It was just, let's get plowed all the time. So, but I guess the point that I'm coming around to is that I could rationalize pretty well.
Yeah. But
underlying my programming, my subconscious programming, was programmed based on my environment. A lot of that environment is childhood environment.
Absolutely.
And all the what were rationalizations that I had that were basically the thinking mind, the rational mind, were undermined.
Absolutely.
By these preconceived, prior planted programming that had happened in my subliminal, my subconscious mind.
Yeah.
And you said it, you know what I mean? Like, I know what to do for a job interview, right? You know what I mean? And I do too. I know I'm articulate, I'm intelligent, I know how to carry myself well and convey thoughts. But underlying that is a subconscious mind battle. You know what I mean? It's, like to think that low self-esteem and low self-worth are driven by, a lot of times it wasn't like a self-talk. You know what I mean? It wasn't like,
exactly. That's
it wasn't like I was thinking about myself in a negative way before.
That happen, but
no. This was a feeling, right? This was not, something that I was.
Ease.
Yes, fucking right, 100%, right? And it ties into. So you arrive at recovery, right? We're given the gift of desperation, that's basically trying to escape that fucking ease, right? My whole fucking life. It was like anytime, first of it was like, off to the races, but really what it was doing was what your father did. It was avoidance, right? You know what I mean? I was practicing avoidance. It was like a way for me to disconnect myself from that dis-ease temporarily and exude some new traits that were probably more acceptable to my peers, because the reality of it was that even though I exuded these outward thoughts and these outward appearances in this avatar, the underlying dis-ease undermined that, which made it difficult to navigate my way through. And I geeked out, or I arted out, or you know what I mean? Like, and then suddenly it was like, here I was using, and now suddenly I was the life of the party. And then suddenly I was I had personality, or suddenly I was like, I was good with women, or I was like, all those things that were ultimately undermined by my low self-esteem and low self-worth and discomfort and dis-ease.
Exactly.
It was like I kind of put my dis-ease on pause temporarily, and then my frontal mind took over for a bit. But as soon as I stopped using it, it was back again. Yeah. And usually it was running roughshod over anything that had just come from it not existing. So it was like then I was forced to keep using, because if I didn't keep using, my dis-ease came back and fucked up anything that I did. So I arrive in recovery, right? And, some of the things that I wrestled with early on, there's an author by the name of Napoleon Hill. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Napoleon. Okay, so Napoleon Hill was a author that he was a cub reporter in the 1920s that went to write an article on Andrew Carnegie, who at the time was the nation's first recorded billionaire. He was the world's first recorded billionaire. And the story goes that he went to him with his little cub reporter paperwork and Carnegie sat down with him and said, listen, he said, instead of writing an article on me, he said, I want to commission you to do a research study. He said, I'm not going to pay you any money. He said, but what I'm going to do in exchange is I'm going to line up other people, right, that you can talk to, and I want you to do a study on what makes successful people successful and what makes average people average and what's the difference. Now, you would think growing up in school, this would be fucking part of your curriculum. Yeah. You know what I mean? And here it is. I didn't hear about it now until I was well into my late 20s, right? And then what did he do? He put him in front of Rockefeller. He put him in front of Gillette. He put him in front of Wanamaker. He basically the who's who of who were successful. And, and from that, he did a 20-year research study of what makes average people average and successful people successful and what the differences are. And then from that, he wrote this very, very, comprehensive volumes of this series of books called Success Laws. And from Success Laws, the abridged version, the shorty version of it is this book called Think and Grow Rich, right? So, and Think and Grow Rich, so I'm well into my using, right? You know what I mean? And difficulty grasping, like I used to say, success in life, it was like my hands were greased. Yeah. Like I just couldn't get a grip on the world around me. You know what I mean? Like I was building castles in the sand. It wasn't sustainable. And somebody had given me that book, and I completely enamored by it. Still to this day, I think the reason for my success, a lot of it is tied to that book. But were 2 chapters in that book that I always just kind of I got to the chapter and I was like, skip. And one of them was substance abuse. Right? You know what I mean? That, that it was impossible to achieve success with substance abuse. And the other one was, for all intents and purposes, prayer and a power greater than yourself. And those 2 chapters, I was like, skip, right? And that's why I could never get a grip on the wall. Yeah. You know what I mean? Because not really recognizing how incredibly important it's because it was a preconceived dogma that made me fearful of faith. Yeah. And it was a pre-existing condition that made me resistant to change with regards to substance abuse. So there were 2 things that were essential. And when we talk about success, we can talk about monetary success. But there's so many other types. Success in life has far more to do than just monetary success. Success in relationships, success in quality of life, success in exploration of what's to come, all those other things. And in the end, those 2 chapters I skipped, only to come to recovery and the gift of desperation. And only to realize that in the end, when I removed the abuse of substances, right, and then in a deeper level of exploration was able to explore a faith that wasn't rooted in dogma than I could find on my own, that wasn't based on some preconceived notion of an old man with a beard overhead talking to me whatever, right? So I had the ability to find a loving, caring power greater than me, right? And that exploration of faith giving me a firmer foundation, right, for what rationalization would give me, right? Because that was the problem. And you talked about that. Like, I know what to do. Yeah. I think my way through it. But the problem was there was no thinking that could fill the spiritual problem that I had underneath, which was that spiritual brokenness. And without believing in something that just got done, probably, I say just got done, but probably a few years ago, I parsed over a book that was excellent. It's called The Power of the Subconscious Mind. And what it talked about was, it dances around religion, right? But in the process of that, something that it talked about really, really caught me. And that was that what they found is that the psychological advantages of believing in religion were found to be, ooh, I'm actually leaking. I'm surprised. The psychological benefits from belief in religions and things like that were found to be just as effective, even in cases where those religions were easily and obviously refutable. So, so you go, well, wait a minute. Like, so what you're really telling me is that the people that are deep in belief in going clear.
Yeah.
Right. You know what I mean? And, a religion that was, that was crafted by, for all intents and purposes, one of our better sci-fi writers of all time.
Yeah.
Right, could ultimately give people that same benefit, even though from an exterior perspective, we look at it and we go, clearly and obviously refutable. Like this is a disease. This is a religion that was crafted in our time by somebody who clearly wasn't. You know what I mean? Like, and and I don't want to say made up in the interest of I don't know anybody who's a Scientologist, but but in the end, here's these people that are getting the spiritual benefits from a refutable belief. And here I was, right? I went around the world 2.5 times in the Navy. So I was in Hong Kong, I was in Singapore, I was in the United Arab Emirates, I was in all these places. And every time I saw people practicing organized religion, I was like, you see that? They're all wrong. Right. It was like, it was you know what I mean? Like, look at these people running this fool's errand.
Yeah.
Right. Look at these people, in a way of making myself feel psychologically superior. What I was really undermining was any benefit for being able to grasp a power greater than me for spiritual reasons. Right. And what I come to realize by reading that book was where I was wrong was, because my thought was they're all believe different things, so they're all wrong.
Yeah.
And what I come to believe is that underlying all those different things they believe, they're all right.
I agree with you.
Right? You know what I mean? Like they're expressing a human thing about a power that Gregory, remember Gregory? Gregory said one time, and I was in a spot where I was trying to get my finger on this whole higher power thing, man. Because if I can't fucking explain it, it don't exist, right? You know what I mean? Because if I can't put my fucking finger on it, then it's all bullshit. And he said, I know God no more than an ant knows me.
Right.
And still to this day, I'm like,
ineffable is the word. Ineffable.
Yeah. And today I'm like, I realize that it doesn't matter. I don't have to define it. I can enjoy the benefits of what's undefinable, right? I can gain a power that transcends my ability to be able to rationalize, because I'm my own worst enemy in my subconscious mind, undermining whatever the fuck I rationalized in my, in my thinking mind.
Yeah. I think the example of Scientology is very interesting because I think so. If we were to kind of survey, I think net what you're saying, I 100%, like the net effect of that belief on the average person or the plurality of people that are interviewed.
Right.
But then you have other things, and it's not knocking. I mean, obviously, I agree with you. Like some parts of it are just clearly like fanciful and fantastic. But whether it's that part or maybe some other parts, where they might just have something in that belief system, say like the traditions.
Right.
So there can still be errors, and it's hard to know whether it's found in the doctrine or if it's found in the practice, because doctrine and practice reinforce each other, right? But either way, it's totally okay to be like, you know what, the way you guys handle your hierarchy, that really looks kind of cultish. And you have like a pyramid scheme going on there, and there's abuses.
You're talking about what we do too, at least in part. Well, because when I arrived, I was like, you know what? Like, here's the thing, right?
We have protections in place.
We do,
more than other places.
But there are
still excesses.
There are cultures. There are culture aspects of the recovery community that look cult-ish, right? And actually that's why you have to be given the gift of desperation, because you got to stick long enough to realize that what you perceive as a cult is really people in alignment and social belief.
And there's trade-offs.
Fucking right. You know what I mean? Because it really, in the process of that, it eliminates the need for the individual thinker in the beginning.
There's some conformity.
Yes, like you have to, in the beginning, you got to get into the hive before you, right.
Absolutely.
Right. And we talked about that before the meeting before the meeting, is that in the beginning, I had to kind of take a bit of a, you know, let's say more of like a purist role in the beginning for in the interest of my own sanity and in the interest of maintaining a level of success. I had to drink the whole Kool-Aid, not just sip on it. But later on, you realize that there are many paths to the top of the mountain.
Well, you also explored the whole space, because I think people often make this mistake of the either or thinking, and it's not coincidental that people who are hypervigilant tend to black or white thinking, because when you're in hypervigilance, the part of your brain that governs nuanced thinking, the blood doesn't flow there, because the blood's flowing to the part where you need to survive. You're an enemy or you're not, right? And I think a lot of times people can be like, well, you know, NA is this, or the Catholic Church is this, or Mormonism is this, and it's not that. And so, and it's like, what? Well, there's a whole, you know, like I listened to this guy, John Vervaeke, who's a cognitive scientist, and he talks about all the different things that religions offer a lot. There's different ways of knowing. And we talked about like an arena, right? Like a lot of it's bodily. It's like you're engaged in ritual. Like we get up and we circle up and we clap when people are, and we get up, and it's that movement that like that opens you up. That's ritual. A different kind of knowing, right? And so in order to know which parts are better and which parts are less, and that's also dependent on who you are, right? Like that's relative and subjective to some extent. It's better to, I think you're right, to kind of, and that's an advocacy for faith in a very specific way. To have faith, explore the space. Because you might be refuting the wrong thing, right? You don't know what you're refuting the whole shebang, right?
100%. You know what? Like that, boy, that's fucking wise. So many people arrive. Yeah. And you're looking for a reason to refute. Yeah. And that's why I think the gift of desperation needs to be strong. Yeah. Right? Stronger.
It overrides that.
Strong, right. Because I'm like, fuck, I don't know what these people are talking about. This shit looks like a cult, but you know what? I'm going to sit the fuck in anyway, because what else is there out there? It can't be
worse than the crack house.
Fucking right. You know what I mean?
Or
like I'm about to be
fucking of my apartment.
Yes, I'm about to be dead. Yeah. Right? So these people are smiling. They might be smiling because they're drinking some sort of weird fucking Kool-Aid, but I'm going to stick in for a while. And that's the shame of it, is some people come in and through a discomfort and through a need to refute what they see, they'll choose the hell of what's out there versus rather have people come in and stay long enough. What I find is if people stay long enough that, and I don't know whether, and I can't speak for other fellowships or other 12-step programs or whatever, but if you stay long enough, you can gain enough information as to whether or not your sensation of whether things are refutable or founded or not.
Absolutely.
Right? But give yourself a chance to get the help and allegiance with others. And here's the thing. Even if, you know what, like faith is about jumping off the ledge and building your wings on the way down, right? Yeah. You know what I mean? So some of like, you know, and I think part of the reason why I think this conversation could be potentially important to others, and if not others, then certainly at least you and I, right, is that, you know, if you're on the outside and you're like, I'm jammed up and I'd really like to go to one of those 12-step fellowships, or I'd really like to get help, but when I go see a therapist or when I go to these places, I feel like I can find plenty of reasons to refute. Yeah. And my suggestion is fucking do it anyway. Right. Right? Because if you can expose yourself to it long enough, make a educated, explorative decision on whether or not help can be gotten from the place before you refute it. It's kind of like going in, I'm having a fucking heart attack, and I go to the fucking ER, and I go to see the guy, you know, and I go to see I got an ER doc comes running up to me, and he's like, put the paddles on him, and I'm like, oh, I don't really like the way that looks, and I don't really like what color are you wearing?
I don't like
and
his bedside.
I don't like his bedside.
I want a different doctor.
Yeah,
you don't have the
fucking
luxury
dude's
of that right
yeah, the dude's fucking like he's about to fucking shock my heart into rhythm, right? And I'm like why don't you stay long enough to save your fucking life? And then if ultimately you decide to choose another path, well then by all means, but they don't coexist well, and people will, in the interest of trying to refute what ultimately would be their help, refute the very fucking thing that could potentially save their life. And their subconscious, what we're talking about, is running the fucking show, because in their head they're like, yeah, you know what, like, I don't know, like my first meeting, I didn't feel fucking comfortable, but they were all happy and smiling and laughing, and I was like, fuck, dude, it was bleak between my ears, man. My soul was dead. These people I didn't give a fuck if my life was miserable or whatever. I was staying. You know what I mean? And it wasn't for the fucking coffee.
The people that I've been graced to be in a position to help over the years, I've tried to respect their, call it critical thinking, and respect their even rebelliousness. But again, sort of what you're saying, you have these questions, or you have these differences, or you want to push up against the conformity, do it from within rather than from without. And because sometimes people have real objections, and this is funny because I never connected the two, but recently I was my parents, our religion was politics, and I'm not going to get in. I'm not saying one side is better than the other.
No,
right?
I dig it.
I'm just giving his example, and I ended up reacting because there were excesses in their belief system. We talked about it before, like the victim mentality, but then there was some good stuff. There was searching for justice and caring about the underdog and open-mindedness, and the world isn't just easily divided. Like conservatives sometimes are like, it's just this. Like there's weaknesses to both sides, right?
100%.
And what I came upon this, and I'm not going to name the tradition I'm in now for my outside spiritual help because it's not important, and I don't want. But they have a concept of it, and it's the same. It's the same thing we're talking about. They are very the thinkers and the writers who have been a part of this tradition over the centuries. From what I can gather, they're very wary of revolution, a revolutionary spirit, but reform is a totally different animal. And my parents were revolutionaries. And if we go right back to that question of masculinity and the conflict that I grew up in, they just wanted to upend all the gender roles. They're like, we can just create new roles.
Right.
And what I want to do and what I've come to in my middle age is it's like, no, I'm starting with some what would be considered traditional norms, but I want them to be expanded and reformed.
Right.
So when you talk about like gender roles, you talk about sexuality, you talk about masculinity, like there's a whole room for different types of masculinity. Like you can have feminine stuff. You can be gay. There's gay men who are
more masculine than both of us.
Exactly.
Believe it. Right.
And so it's a very complex picture. And there's totally straight guys who are just more feminine.
Yeah, more feminine, and and those they tend to bear. I think that at least for men who are who are more traded more feminine tend to bear the challenges and the difficulties associated with navigating their way through society, because at least for men that are more effeminate, the world is at least in part not receptive. It's not their oyster.
No.
Right. So now you work in, I want to say, the field.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about what you do now.
So I work for local government. So the way that drug and alcohol treatment is funded, is there's three ways essentially. And the one way is if you actually have insurance through your job or through your parents. Right. The second way is if you have Medicaid. Right. And the vast majority of people, this is kind of excluding people whose alcohol is their main thing. Right. Because alcohol is more socially acceptable, so that tends to skew, even though alcohol ravages you in some ways more. Right. But they tend to hold onto their jobs a little longer.
Right.
Because it's not done in the shadows. And I don't want to go too far into that, but it's very interesting to me. It's just as damaging, but because it's legal, those people are like they're less on the outskirts. So people, their primary thing, or there's just even if they're doing alcohol, but there's significant substance use in addition to the alcohol, the majority of them that find themselves needing treatment don't have insurance.
Right.
And they're not working. So they are, for a time, eligible for Medicaid.
Okay.
So in Pennsylvania, there's Medicaid dollars that flow to the counties. And once at the county level, if you get Medicaid, you'll get an insurer who has a network of, it's an HMO type situation. And you have an insurer who will govern, like has a network for your physical health. So it's a different insurer, and you have a card, and you can see who's in network. You can go see this doctor who accepts your Aetna, but it's Aetna through Medicaid, right? Or it could be Keystone East. And then you have there's behavioral health provider, insurer effectively, and it used to be Magellan, now it's something called CCBH, right? So money is given to CCBH for people who have Medicaid to go to inpatient and outpatient treatment. Now, what happens is sometimes there's a period when people who are eligible for this Medicaid, but they haven't gotten down to the welfare office, or the welfare office is in the process of processing, but they need their treatment. They're going to die, and they want to go.
Right.
There's money sent through my office for those people, and then for people who, and for a while there, we weren't able to do this because the money there wasn't enough of it. We had to ration it. But now it's for people who they could technically, conceivably have their own insurance, but maybe they're working in labor and would have to buy their own insurance, or they're working in hospitality. They have to buy their insurance. And so there's money for them too. So they're not eligible. They're over the income for Medicaid, which is like, I think 180% of the poverty line. So it's something like $20,000 or something like that.
Right,
it's crazy.
Right.
So, but they're in that middle where they don't make enough, or their job doesn't provide it, or they just haven't bought it. And we're not.
Now, how does that work? Is it assistance, or is it a stipend, or how is
so basically, the individuals can go to one of these assessment sites, or in our county, Delaware County, Keystone functions as both an assessment site and also an inpatient facility. So you could call Keystone, and they can assess you and admit you, or they can assess you and refer you to another inpatient facility that's in surrounding counties. Or you can go to MVP or American Treatment Network, and they offer outpatient. But if you need inpatient, and that's part of why you would go there, is because they need to figure out whether you need inpatient, right?
Right.
Because you may not rise to what's called the criteria of that level of care. You might not need that intensive. You're not using enough, and it's not. You'll be safe as based on these criteria, going to a less restrictive is the technical terminology, less restrictive environment that outpatient or intensive outpatient can provide. But you go there, and if you go in, you're like, I have a problem, and they'll start asking you. They'll do an assessment, ask you, what are you using, and then they determine you need inpatient. And they say, well, what's your insurance? They're like, I don't have any insurance. They would contact myself or my partner, who does the same thing I do at our office, and we trust them. So they just send over a bunch of documents. We look at them, and we trust them most of the time. But they're essentially applying for this, and then they'll send them off to Bowling Green, and Bowling Green will work with us. And if they're there for 5 days, we'll pay for those 5 days of detox. Mm-hmm. And then Bowling Green will be like, well, we think they should step down. And we'll give them 14 days of inpatient rehab, and then maybe another 7 days. And then maybe another 7 days after that. And so we pay the provider directly on behalf of the client.
Now, have any of those funds been impacted by the changes in the administration and some of those things?
Not yet.
Not yet. Do you anticipate that there's a possibility of that?
What is it? It's 3D chaos chess or something like that. And those, obviously, that's an oxymoron, because chess is not chaotic.
Right.
But it's either 3D chess, or it's chaos, or it's a little bit of both, right? Like I hate that person, and this is not saying he's good or bad. I'm just saying this is more a label based on my, like, a lot of stuff we're talking about, a lot of things I've studied in history and archetypes, personas, avatars. He's a chaos magician.
Right.
Right? Like there's all through mythology, there's chaos. That's a shamanic tradition to be able to, like, we talked about psychological warfare. He's a chaos magician. So I don't know what he's going to do.
You know what?
I don't know what's going to happen.
I think he's stupid like a fucking fox. That very well could be the case also. So a good example is a gentleman that was in here 2 shows previous. He is in procurement for Department of Defense.
Oh wow!
So so they're in right now the program that he runs. He's got a team of I think 15 to 20 people. They do procurement for technologies for ground fighting vehicles for the warfighter. So, and he and I talk constantly because we serve together, and he's one of my closest friends. And some of the conversations we've had recently, like that release that went to federal employees that said that, to opt in to retire.
Right.
Came with some terminology that was actually exactly the same terminology that was used when Elon Musk bought Twitter. He called it the fork in the road, and literally the name of the email that was sent to all DOD employees, to all federal employees, was the fork in the road.
Right.
And and it caused like this chaos.
Yeah.
Like through all the administration, from and not just DOD but at all federal levels, and his job basically was to, as Jules said in Pulp Fiction, cool these motherfuckers out.
Yeah.
Right? Like he was trying to keep everybody cool, so he was like, dude, he said, figuratively, they're in the parking lot right now trying to think about how to jump off the ledge and shit, right? And I'm like, he said, I'm just trying to keep these motherfuckers chilled out, right? He said, but when we started thinking about it, the same thing with, the threats with immigration. Like clearly, it would be cost prohibitive.
Yeah.
To remove, the undocumented who have arrived, in spite of the impact that influx.
That's his
people.
Starting point. It's almost like a negotiation tactic. He has to start hard because otherwise it'll get watered down to nothing.
Well, not even just that, but so the after effect is to, in that shift, for people who are either fearful or on the edge for other reasons. And what Dave said was great. He was like, if you were right now kind of like working at DOD, phoning it the fuck in, or in government in general, right? And you were like, say one more word to me, motherfucker, and I'm out of here. And you get this letter that's kind of threatening, and in the letter there's a button that says retire here, and you click that button. There ain't no going back from that. Now you're on the fucking list. So what it really did was culled the herd for thousands and thousands of people who were basically phoning it in and fucking frustrated
you
with.
threw something out there and see how people respond.
Same thing with, like, okay, we can't physically. There are 3,000 miles of northern and southern unsecured border.
Right.
You can't build a wall. It would be financially prohibitive to build a wall on either side. But what you can do in the meantime is send a signal that don't come across the border unless you go through specific channels. The only way you can really do that is by instilling a level of fear. That's unfortunate.
Right.
But is it effective? Fuck yeah. 95% less people are coming across the southern border right now because they know the administration's not favorable to them, and they don't want to get scooped up, have the bracelets put on, and sent back to Mexico or South America or wherever they came from. So that's what I mean by stupid like a fox, because a lot of people think that, that he's a dummy. And I think he panders to, whoever gets him elected, right? But I think in a lot of ways, you know what I mean? Like, and I'm not going to say that he's a brilliant tactician. He may or may not be.
Right.
But what I am saying is clearly he's surrounding himself with some people that are thinking through some things at a deep enough level, and they're making those moves. Now, on the downside of that is, in order to move to whatever the fuck is next, whatever the fuck is now gets broken. And that's scary.
Some things can get broken.
Yeah, and that's scary, right? You know what I mean? Because it's like, okay, you know what I mean? Like,
there's a lot of fragility in what's called a complex.
Fucking right. You know what I mean? And so, and yes, it's an ecosystem.
Yeah.
Right. And the interesting thing about that is, like they talk about it with forestry. They say that we can clear cut a forest and then we can replant the forest. And yes, it's a forest, but the ecosystem that was underlying the previous forest is gone.
Yeah.
Right? And that'll never come back again. Right? So on one side, you've got, okay, we have to clear cut this forest to build a fresh forest, and that forest isn't going to look like the forest. You know what I mean? Like some of the ecosystem may be gone, and frankly, from an interest of not being kind, it may be unkind to people that live or survive off that ecosystem. But at the same time, we're 8 years from fucking complete bankruptcy.
Yeah, I know.
So we don't really, you know, anybody can paint whoever the administration is that's doing what needs to be done, right? You know, as the axis of evil, so to speak. And there might be some truth to that. I'm not going to negate that there might not be some truth to that. But on the other side, it's like, who's going to do the fucking hard thing, right? And, you know, and frankly, it may take somebody who is currently no longer electable, right, to do what must be done, even if it makes you fucking unpopular, because there's no way to clear cut this forest and replant it without being unpopular. And you may go down as the most unpopular motherfucker in history, even though there's the difference between reality and narrative.
Yeah.
Right? You know what I mean? So, and that's hard because meanwhile, all of us, you and me and just about every other human being in the United States are affected one way or the other by this clear cut and replant. And there's no way to fucking, like, before that whole shit about drain the swamp, that was bullshit. That was just talk. This is drain the swamp. This is what he fucking meant in the first term that he couldn't get done because he planted his administration with people that were basically, for all intents and purposes, part of that same ecosystem that would be getting cut. There was no way to do that. And now I was listening yesterday to, you know, some hearings about Doge. And, you know, one of the Democratic senators was drilling, you know, the representative who was, it wasn't Musk that was speaking on behalf of Doge, but he asked, you know what I mean? He said, you guys got rid of, and then he just rattled off one by one, senior heads of departments that had been fired. And every one of those senior department heads were senior department heads that were investigating one of Elon Musk's fucking businesses. And I was in the other, Dean was in the other side. I kept going, ooh. But then again, at the same time, you go, well, how many people are equipped to do what must be done that also get the benefit from what there is, right? Like a good example of that, you know, because people have been drawing all these examples between what happened in the Second World War and how our industrial, you know, our military industrial complex was built in the first place. And the reason why we were able to mobilize so much war goods, war manufacturing, was because we made it in the financial best interest of those that could manufacture those goods. Right now, you know, did it save our country? Yes. Would we be speaking German and Japanese if it didn't happen? Fucking absolutely.
But those relationships continued after the war.
Therein lies the challenge, is the very same thing that saves you might also now be your bedfellow, right? And here we are now in a situation where, you know what I mean? Like people are like, fucking Elon Musk, that motherfucker. You know what I mean? Like they're right? You know, because he is going to gain. There was a reason why all the billionaires sat in at the fucking inauguration of Trump this time around. You know what I mean? Because they were like, yeah, let's deregulate some shit, motherfuckers. Let's do this. But on the same side, there's very same people that will stand to benefit, and the disparity between finance, you know, between people who the have mores and the have less. Yeah. There's no way around that. Those are also the same people that will simultaneously could potentially, are the only people that I really believe have a chance of financially saving this country ultimately from ruin. Yeah. Because it's only a certain amount. Remember, wasn't that many shows ago, I got a guy in here who's in DOD procurement, and he'll tell you fucking flat out, China is kicking our ass. Right? You know what I mean? They're stealing our IP. They're beating us to the punch with fucking innovating, and year by year they become near peer, right? You don't want to go to war with near peer. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like you don't want that. You don't want to put a man his age, right? Your daughter, my son, my youngest, put him in a uniform and send him into a situation where American primacy is fucking important in only one case, and that's war. Right? You know what I mean? Because otherwise it's your kids getting sent home in a fucking box. Now, I'm not one, nobody hates war more than the fucking warfighter.
Right.
You know what I mean? So I'm not one to advocate for any kind of war. And frankly, I think we've been in several conflicts that we shouldn't have been there. But on the other side, right? You know what I mean? Like something needs to be done to otherwise, because you don't want to live in a world without American primacy.
Yeah, and it's like that was part of the problems with the value system of my parents at sometimes is that they were naive ideologues sometimes. So it's like it's just not right. And it's like the more I've become conservative in a lot of ways as I've gotten older, but one of the things I've remained kind of more of like a leftist progressive is on war. However, that being said, like most people don't know that the post-war international context, they call it the Bretton Woods agreement, was part of that. There was a meeting and like the petrodollar.
Right.
Part of that was we signed up to patrol, you were a Navy, to patrol the oceans. And then we have all these bases. And that has allowed like international trade to exist in a certain level. And
without question.
Right. And it's like dismantling that has short-term costs. So in a moral calculus, you could argue from pure principles, okay, we just don't want to, because these bad actors slip in, these sociopathic.
But it also represents the removal of globalism, because the only reason why globalism exists is because the United States controls the oceans. And I had an argument with a very intelligent doctor. So I write for Forbes Business Council.
I saw that, yeah.
Right, and she was also a Forbes Business Council member, and I attended this, it was like a round table, and they broke us off into separate tables. And then at one point, I ended up just in a room, and just her and I don't know how it really happened. And, she was clearly is there sound going on here? Oh, it's okay. We won't pick it up in the mics. She was clearly an intellect, and with a doctor and a bunch of letters behind her name or whatever. And she worked in, European intelligence consulting and some other things. Like she was pretty highfalutin. And I was like, well, and in the conversation, I said, something to the effect of, we patrol the world's oceans. And she was like, who told you that? And I was like, excuse me? And she was like, we don't patrol the world's oceans. She was like, that's misconstrued. That's misconceived. You know what I mean? Like her position was, and I thought to myself, like, I don't have a problem with people taking position. And frankly, you know what I mean? Like there might be some accuracy in it, but I've stood on the fucking deck of a fucking warship and been in places where
they sail around the world.
Yes, like literally, and not just that,
in a regular fashion.
But I have seen our NATO partners, right?
Right.
And the little bullshit they fucking come to the table with.
Right.
They're not there. They are there to let us do what the fuck we do, right? The one little Italian warship and the one little British warship and the one, they don't bring the heat like we do. They have no financial interest in it whatsoever. And they don't have fucking skin in the game from fucking, from blood and risk like we do either. Yeah. You know what I mean? So to tell me that, that we don't patrol the world, I was like, get the fuck out of here, right? I was like, oh yeah, you're right. And I was like,
well, that goes back to what we were talking about with the narrative. I mean, some people would want to change that verb that we I don't know what the verb would like that would attach like a fascist or imperialist intent. We impose our will on the oceans. Like they would they would want to like
and they'd be fucking glad we do, because sooner or later
good.
Yeah, because sooner or later, like if we don't patrol the South China Sea, the Chinese will.
They will.
Which means that everything that comes through the South China Sea will be under the fucking guise and control of the Chinese CCP, which means that, you know what I mean? Like we will not be able to get goods effectively back and forth through. And all the other world's goods will be affected. 70% of the world's goods come through the South China Sea. So everybody else gets affected too. Yeah. You know what I mean? So it's like, we cannot maintain that level of primacy or protection for the American people without standing on strong financial footing.
Right.
It's impossible to do.
Yeah.
So what we're doing right now, as painful it is a national security issue.
Yeah.
Right? You know what I mean? And that's the hard part and that's what people don't realize is that, yeah, you know what I mean? Like, this is uncomfortable and it's going to displace and hurt a lot of people. It really is. And I don't make light of that.
Right.
But we won't have a fucking country in a decade if we don't do something. You know, shit pops off in fucking Taiwan.
Yeah.
And watch what the fuck happens.
Yeah, and I think my layperson understanding, having like listened to and watched a lot of conversations over the years, is that I feel like sometimes the fiscal conservatives don't frame it correctly, because what they say is they argue that we have to achieve a balanced budget, and it's more complex than that. That a government being the reserve, having a reserve currency, being able to print money essentially,
right?
You can have deficits. It's just deficits of a certain kind,
right?
Coupled with certain growth trends or lack thereof, it can become unsustainable. And
right, and that's where we're at now.
And a lot of times, but unfortunately, people that are pro reining that in sometimes don't do that side of the question justice, because they frame it as that we have to be like a household. They use that analogy, and so the other people who represent that keep doing that, like, they make short work of those people, because that's not actually what you need to do, right? Like that's
100%.
That's more talk about billionaires. That's what, like, certain interests would like that, because that would be in their best interest.
Right.
That's not the same. Now, it is still tricky. It's tricky to run deficits. So that much is true. But I think that the truth is somewhere in the middle. And right now, I think the other side, I think what they get wrong is they don't understand. And a lot of economics being divorced from psychology, being divorced. They created a science of it, but it has to do with human motivations on a grand scale.
Right.
Is the signals that people get from an economy that is driven by a lot of government spending, is that it can work in multiple ways. I mean, there's government jobs where those people turn around and spend money, and it creates value. Or, like, to go back to what I do for a living, like, that money, like, helping people, like, restoring those people ideally into a state of recovery, restoring their health in some way, has ripple effects on the economy. But you also, if you have a core number of people who aren't getting ahead, they're demoralized psychologically. Right. They stop going the extra mile.
Oh, without question.
And if you don't mind, I just do want to say something real quick. We can get back to that line of conversation. But like, being on here, I am not. I have to put, like, a little, like, thing I put on my social media. Like, I'm not speaking for the county of Delaware on here. However, I will. I'm
not speaking for the federal government, just for the record as well.
Right.
So,
but I think it's in the public interest to describe what I do, and, like, how, like, essentially, if somebody has a drug and alcohol problem and they're interested in drug and alcohol professional licensed drug and alcohol treatment, and they live in Delaware County, their insurance status should not be an object. And it's not a guarantee they would get funded, but a lot of people think I can't go because I don't have insurance.
What website would they go to? How would they get help? Is there a number to call?
So there's a bunch of avenues. So you could go to the Delaware County government website and look under Human Services. There's a 1-800 Get Help Now number that is run by the state. But
is that 1-800 Get Help Now?
Exactly.
You hear that?
1-800.
All my Delco peeps. 1-800 Get Help Now.
And they know the Delaware County process, which essentially will be. There's, like, 4 what we call anchor providers that serve basically mostly the Medicaid population and uninsured and underinsured population, but they also can help people with insurance. But typically, if you have your own insurance, there's it's like 2-tiered system, unfortunately. There's another tier that accepts of facilities, including out-of-state ones that are more fancy.
Right.
If you have private commercial insurance, a lot of times you can go to that. And it's not, when I say higher, I'm not saying it's higher. It's different.
It's bougie insurance.
Right. But doesn't mean you can't go to some of these facilities here and that they don't do good work. But if you're uninsured, a lot of these, they have to contract with with the government or contract with the Medicaid provider in order, and a lot of them are not interested in it because it's the same problem that is there with Medicaid with all things, lots of different things in the healthcare system, is that the reimbursement, there's differences. Although we give more time than most commercial insurances, and we approve, and so does CCBH, the Medicaid provider, but the daily rate isn't as high.
So it limits how schmancy the places that you'll go to.
But
you know what I mean?
most commercial insurances won't, like if you're like doing cocaine and you're not gonna go and withdraw, they're not gonna send you inpatient. They'll say go to outpatient.
Right.
Right. And you have to be at imminent risk of death. And then once you're there, most of the time.
Well, that would be what? Opiates, alcohol.
Typically, opiates you will be very, very uncomfortable, but
alcohol is the number one.
Alcohol and benzodiazepines.
Yeah.
Those two, with opiates, if you don't have any kind of pre-existing health problems that are known, you can survive.
You can ride. It's going to be a nasty fucking storm, but you can ride the fucking storm.
Exactly.
You're not going to die.
And so being the public, coming from the public sector, we're more humane. And that's the thing that I brought to the table, I think, in my role, being in recovery and wanting to be an advocate, like that I was taught by my mother and my father for the underdog. Being an advocate for humanity and humaneness is that I've tried within the constraints of my leadership, constraints of whatever. Mm-hmm. I don't control how much money is in the system, but if we can try to make a reasonable effort to get the word out that these services exist, and then have these services be treating, because that's what we do. We collaborate. We represent. We're supposed to represent the residents of Delaware County, and we're also supposed to be stewards of taxpayer money, right? And so we collaborate with these providers that we have contracts with, and the intent is so that people who go to these places get treated. And it's nothing. What I'm about to say is nothing against providers. I'm not criticizing any providers, but what I'm saying, broadly speaking, across the spectrum, up until several years ago, a lot of times when somebody had a substance use disorder and they presented, and some of it's just people just didn't know what to do with them.
Right.
And the resources were very limited. And a lot of times these people, we talked all about it. It's like this long conversation has been about pain and fear, right? Pain and fear driving people. So people will have their defense mechanisms, like their thorns are out. They're not sure whether they want to get help.
Right.
So they go to a hospital and the nurse has, or the doctor, they have everything, because those big health systems, most of the time they want to make money, or even if they're nonprofits, they still have to regiment time. So there's not extra space necessarily to be like, oh, let me research what you can do in your particular situation. You're doing drugs. They're like, you're medically cleared? Call Keystone.
Right.
And Keystone didn't have a bed 7 years ago. What were you supposed to do? And a lot of times, again, across the board, a lot of providers historically, none of the current providers, and again, it's more across the board, across the country, not just here. A lot of times, being mostly publicly funded, a lot of times you would get the problem of people on the front desk. It's this weird thing, and it's funny because I dealt with this with my dental office, where the receptionist where I get my dental work at, I had to go get a root canal in order to get a crown. And so they didn't do the root canal there, so I had to go to an endodontist, right? And so the endodontist and my dental office had to communicate. And as I was navigating that process, my dental office assistant it was like she was actively trying to dissuade me from using her services. like if she could blow me off and not have to deal with me for 15 minutes, even though it would cost her, she was going to do that, because she was choosing her short term. So she was like not helping me, like actively like almost gaslighting me. And that's kind of common. And you add in stigma.
Right.
You have people, and again, I'm not no one specific. It's more underfunded. You have people front desk. You go in there. They're like, all right, well, you got to come back tomorrow at 7 a.m. Or no, we don't accept your insurance when they do accept. Or we can't help people that don't have insurance. It's like, no, there's a contract there from your local county government office, like the one and they would just blow people off. And these people were shooting heroin, smoking crack, some of them homeless. They don't. Nobody's going to listen. Who are they going to call?
Right. They're already downtrodden.
Yeah, and people are going to.
And if somebody doesn't step in to advocate for them, they're fucked.
Exactly, and people aren't going to take them seriously. And again, across the board, across the country, like that treatment, for all the ways that in many ways our society, in some ways that we could bemoan some of the things that have happened, the erosion of our traditional values. Some of them are like these masculine values. We could talk about that for a long time. There's also the other side to it, and this is represented, at least in what I've observed. We've become softer and more humane.
Right.
In some pockets of our world. So it's not one or the other, right? Like it
depends on where you stand at any given moment.
And to treat people who have essentially a health problem, it's not that there's not a moral dimension to it. It's not. I'm not advocating that if someone's committed crimes in the commission of their addiction, that they shouldn't have to face the crimes. But while they're trying to get help, they shouldn't be treated differently than somebody who has diabetes.
100% agree. Right. You know what I mean? Like if you're a believer, and I am, that, people suffer from a disease rather than a moral dilemma, then, but there are a lot of people that, in the interest of categorization and spinning a narrative, I think some of that, at least in part, comes from this concept of social hierarchy.
Yeah.
There's the first chapter of one of Jordan B. Peterson's books talks about the hierarchy of lobsters.
Yeah.
It's like the first chapter of I can't remember.
They have hierarchy.
Yes, exactly, and that that this is biologically something that's ingrained into
and you're not
biology.
Just get rid of it.
No, exactly.
For good intentions.
And I think that same social hierarchy that exists in the playground in grade school.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like that's a biological process that's going on where we're establishing, ultimately who will be able to, as they age, mate.
Yeah.
And who will be able to procreate and who will not. You know what I mean? Like that hierarchy's happening. That biological selection is at a very early age.
Yeah.
Right. So I think when people tend to discount others under a narrative like that, I think there's a lot of that going on without maybe the awareness of that, right? You know what I mean? Like, I think people that take positions with regards to things like immigration or, taking, an unkind position to things that have to do with gender identity or some of these other things, really in the end have less to do with an understanding about those other things and more to do with I'm superior and that's inferior. And as long as I see that as inferior, then I get to take a position above in the social hierarchy, right? Which ultimately ties to the biology of my, progeny will live on. Right. You know what I mean? Like it's tied to something that's more biological in nature. And when you see it like that, I at least in part, I look at people who, who are for all intents and purposes assholes under the narrative that they are, and realizing that they're not aware of where the assholishness really comes from. Right. You know what I mean? So I can look at them with that same level of kindness that I would from somebody, maybe not to the same level that I would for the downtrodden, but at least seeing to the effect of, what is that? Forgive them for they know not what they do. You know what I mean? Like, it sucks because the reality of it is that individual creates pain for others. You know what I mean? I don't like to take that position.
No, but
in the interest of surrendering for my own fucking sanity, right?
Well, knowing that that there's these in some ways automatic responses going on, it mitigates a little bit of what's happening. So you don't have to, we don't want to demonize the people they're demonizing. Like that's the same. That's the same error, right?
Yeah, right, exactly.
We want to humanize, but it's the behaviors. And it's funny because I was talking to a friend on social media, and he was talking about basically the political tribalism that's going on. And he came from a rural place. He's really smart, but he came from a rural place, and he's living in a rural place. And he's like, you're really talking about the difference between rural and urban. And he's like, why don't we actually say that rather than just use, like basically someone was smearing him because
sounds like Nate, my boy Nate.
So in other words, people who live in rural parts of America sometimes have different agendas because they have different experiences. So they 100%. Will skew one way, but doesn't mean that you can pigeonhole them. And I remarked, and this is something that I learned from observing I think my mom in some ways, and the effects of trauma on cognition, and where individuals that either are born and or suffer with certain types of trauma, the way that they will see the world will retain a certain childlike aspect to it. And in a sense, one of the symptoms of what's called borderline personality disorder is you either villainize or you idealize, right? And it occurred to me many years ago that, like, what we do with children, and it's just, this has happened organically over time, is that if you look at, like, the moral landscape of a child's imagination, it's populated by villains and heroes, because you need to frame it for them, but they can't protect themselves as quickly, so they need to have very sharp and rigid dividing lines. Whereas when you grow up and you learn boundaries, ideally, and you can physically defend yourself, you can run away, or you can otherwise use your wits to protect yourself, it allows you to have a much more complex, nuanced moral landscape. That comes from
sphere of influence, you know?
Exactly.
And a lot of that really depends on, as you evolve, whether or not what your exposure level is. Frankly, you know, the problems that the inner city and Appalachia have are the same fucking problems now. You know what I mean? Like, you know, the rampant use of opiates, and
changing
economic climates, and poverty, and
technology,
a lot of, and they'll be like, them city people is the problem, and then be like, them country bumpkins, and they're, you know what I mean? And they're basically, they're dealing with the same socioeconomic issues, and but in the end, it's really based on, it's not even sometimes really, I think sometimes it's really based on exposure or isolationism. You know what I mean? Like, if you're willing to be exposed and see what the fuck is actually going on around you, right, then you really realize that a lot of the same problems that you're dealing with are the same problems that the inner cities are dealing with, or vice versa. You know what I mean? And
but I think we all have this, you call it a platform. So we all have, like, a level of our biology and our perception that is always there, and some people just never actually emerge out of it. But I think other people emerge out of it in their local relationships. But when it suddenly is on a larger scale, when it comes to political issues,
then
they end up devolving, and there's interests on the part of this two-party system that actively try to leverage that. So the joke I kind of made, and it's like very inside, nobody would get it, except if I explained it, but it was like, basically, if people talked about their coworkers and their loved ones the way they talk about people and treated people and thought of people the way that they talk about and think of the people on the opposite side of the political aisle, you could diagnose them with with borderline personality disorder. That's diagnosable behavior. So if you're like, you're my enemy, you always try to hurt me, like that creates chaos in your social relationships. It's not sustainable behavior, but suddenly when we're talking about the whole country, you'll do that then. It doesn't make sense. And I've fallen into it. Like, I'm not saying I'm exempt from it.
So strangely enough, like, I tend to fall, like, I have some things, some views that tend to fall on the right end of the spectrum, and some views that tend to fall on the left end of the spectrum, which means that ultimately, for the most part, most of my views are mid-range, more centrically set. You know what I mean? I fall somewhere in the middle.
And when you're a pragmatist, that's what tends to...
But, and I talked about this with the predecessor that was on the show, that gets no fucking airtime.
I know, it's not sexy.
No, you know what I mean? Like, if it doesn't exasperate on one side or the other, right? You know what I mean? Like, the one side of the spectrum is, the extreme far right, I don't think speaks for most Americans, nor do I think the extreme far left does.
No.
Right? I no longer, I don't want to be rich at the risk of everyone else. Right. But I also don't want to eat the fucking rich either.
Yeah, no.
Right? Like, you know what I mean? Like, do I believe that, there are certain, government assistances that need to happen for the sake of, humanity? Absolutely. Do I believe that they're all the enemy? No. Do I believe that, that they're detrimental to us because they've become, extreme and under-regulated and under-managed? Absolutely. You know what I mean? So there's, pragmatism is a fucking flute a coop, right? You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't even really, and the fact of it is that what I just said is fucking inaccurate.
Yeah.
Right? Pragmatism is actually alive and well in this country. It just gets no fucking press.
Well, it's local.
Right.
It happens in our 12-step rooms. It happens like what we're doing right now.
Right.
Like it happens face to face. Like when you have to live amongst other people, you treat them differently. You can't otherize them the same way.
100%.
I mean, you can try, but you're less likely to do it.
It's the further away they are, the easier it is to be us and them.
Yeah. Yeah, them people over the hills.
That's why, one of the most difficult and beautiful times in this country was 9/11.
Yeah, everybody came.
Because everybody was suddenly American.
Yeah.
It didn't matter whether you lived in fucking Oregon or Florida. You were an American. And it didn't really matter what color of skin you had, for the most part. There were exceptions.
Yeah, and I think that to kind of tie it all together, it's what I'm trying to come to in my recovery journey over the years is a lot of times the spiritual language and the spiritual program, you call it, and it's not just in the rooms of the 12-step rooms, but it's like in the self-help language. It's coming from like popularizing of traditional religions. A lot of times that what is advocated often is divorced from the day-to-day. A lot of times it's divorced, and some of it's just because language is difficult. It's difficult to talk about multiple things at the same time and integrate them. So what happens is it's like the spiritual realm gets over here, and what it ends up happening is it becomes too idealized, and there's a concept called spiritual bypass, and a lot of times it's not integrated with what you actually have to do on a day-to-day level. The reality is that like sometimes we're fighting. Right. And that goes back to what I wasn't taught. There's different kinds of fights. Right. And a lot of times there's a gray area between the kind of fights we don't want to have and we don't want our kids to have. There's gray areas between that and the healthy ones. It's not healthy ones over here, bad ones over here. There's like a continuum. And then there's those moments when you meet other souls. And there's moments when you're by yourself and you meet your maker or you meet the whole in those times, that's where the flowery love language can come in. But that flowery love language should not and cannot be divorced from the realities of that we live as flesh and there's suffering and pain. And I don't know how to integrate those two languages because there's truth.
I don't think many people do. Yeah.
But it's like any given day, what I'm faced with and like being blessed to walk with some other men on a recovery path is the reality of human suffering, the reality of human limitation. And sometimes if I'm defaulting to just trust God, I'm not being with that person in their suffering. I'm not helping them accept.
It's actually divorcing yourself from taking the path with them. It's actually
100%.
Yeah, right.
100%. Now, on the other hand, what you have is you have people that clearly only thing, and this is a fear and trauma response, and this represents the survival mentality that I had. I became a nihilist or a hedonist in my active addiction. I was like, the only thing I understand is strength. That's it.
Right.
I'm going to survive and I'm going to feel good. There's nothing else other than that. And hopefully I die soon because I knew that was a dead-end path. But I threw the baby out with the bathwater. I'm like, all that highfalutin, all that fancy, I love you, love me. Like I still tried to be kind to people. But that was always subordinated to what I saw to be this struggle between me and other bits of flesh. Because I did not believe I had a soul, functionally speaking.
Right.
You can believe it up here, but the way you behave.
Feeling.
Yeah, now I'm managing to be like, every day I got to get up and battle as if, and sometimes it feels as if that's the only thing that's happening. It's just material. And it's just, I have to advocate for myself. I have to get enough food on the table. I have to, a lot of it's being middle-aged and taking care of my health and that not always feeling like it's working. And it's a grind. It's like, all I can do is just, and I have to fight in a way that is very similar to the way that I fought in that survival mode.
Right.
But at the same time, above and beyond, at the bottom or the top, whatever metaphor you want to do, what I try to remember is I still have a soul. And so it's about what is most important. So when at the end of the day, like, in what way will I put that struggle aside? In what circumstances? And so it's like, at the end of the day, I rest. Or even during the day, I try to give myself, and it's the best way to talk about it is cheesy language that a lot of people make fun of, but it's like I have to like treat my inner child. That's what I've learned in the different modality other than the one we went to.
Right.
I have to give I deserve to take care of myself. And I feel weak even thinking, I'm like, no, I can work harder. I can push myself harder. It's like, no, I give myself some space. And then when somebody calls me who needs help, that becomes more important.
Right.
But I also will set boundaries in that relationship. But
hey, Dean, what did I say to you in that book I was just reading? Slow down to speed up, right?
Exactly.
Slow down to speed up.
Exactly.
Right?
So integrating that, and what I'm finding is if I'm permitted and I allow myself to have what feels like a feminine, from time to time, feminine relationship with myself and feminine relationship with what call it the Most High, the ultimate, that
right. When we say feminine relationship, we mean an emotional and caring relationship.
And gentle,
right,
where I don't have to struggle and push myself.
Right,
I don't need to be in fight or flight.
Right.
I don't have to worry that somebody's going to hurt me, because that's what I think. My body still thinks that. I think you're going to hurt me. And I like you.
Right.
Consciously, I don't think that, and it's nothing against you.
Yeah. Right. I hear that. Mm-hmm.
It's everybody.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Like I'm like, whoa, human,
Yeah, right.
human hurt.
Right.
That's
right.
human hurt. Like it's like I'm grunting like a monkey. Like that's my monkey mind or my monkey body going, human, hurt me. Must fight.
Right. Uh-huh.
Or I must be your friend. What can I do for you, Jimmy, to make you like me?
Right. Mm-hmm.
While at the same time resenting that I have to do that. So then I'm seeding our relationship with little ego moments because because part of me is like, I don't like that. I'm subordinating myself to him.
Right. Mm-hmm.
I'm making him higher than me.
Right.
I can't do that, but at the same time, so I'm at cross purposes in those interactions with the world. My wires are all mixed up. So it's like separating the two. It's like, and it's something as simple as boundaries, which I didn't learn. It's like,
wow, we went all over the fucking volcano, and we danced quite a bit. You know, I appreciate what you do for the community. I appreciate what you do in your professional life as well. I'm glad we had the opportunity to be able to share some resources that are available for people who need help. And your personal story is powerful. I appreciate that.
Thank
you. Part of the feminine is the journey through intimacy, especially at this level.
Yeah.
When you're doing it like this, you know what I mean? There's a certain there's a power to it.
Yeah.
Right? You know what I mean? And of going from seeing intimacy as weakness to seeing intimacy as strength.
Yeah.
And, that's part of what this whole process, when I talked to my therapist and he said that this was part of my therapy.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because it's only through vulnerability and intimacy that people get to see who you really are, and to do it in a format like this where you get to expose, for all intents and purposes, yourself to the universe, whoever the fuck might see it. And, if it's 100 people or 1,000 people or 1,000,000 people, who knows? But we don't have that kind of traction. Bottom line is, you know what I mean? Like, I'm still putting out into the universe ultimately the closest version of me without the facade that I possibly could. And there's something cathartic about that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, it's neither of us are therapists, and this isn't a therapy session, but the after effects are typically, there's something that happens here.
Yeah.
I haven't quite really put my finger on what that is, because it's not the same in every episode. You know what I mean? It's different because it's a chemistry in a conversation that happens between two people, and you never really exactly know what's going to come out of it or what you're going to get. But what I do tend to find is that a lot of the effects are they're after effects. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, I'll be home later and, something will be calibrated that wasn't before, or a view that I didn't see about the world I see now, or a viewpoint that was shared with me, or an intimacy that was shared with me that, that it brought me to a different way of thinking or viewing or feeling, or an awakening that's spiritual in nature that I can't quite put my finger on, but I just, I feel better. So, you know what I mean?
You mentioned Jordan Peterson, and and between him and actually it was the other guy was a colleague of his while Peterson was still at university, John Vervaeke. But Peterson really pointed me to, and then from what I've read and discussions with my current therapist, I've really cobbled together this idea that human beings we're seeking we're perceiving already hierarchies of value.
Right.
And so you have something like this where there is vulnerability and there's exploration. We're trying to search for truth, right? And at the same time we're talking about things and they're coming up for a reason, right? And this is a hallmark of, you talked about like Freudian psychology or psychiatry. That was one of its hallmarks, was this idea that what you end up talking about is going to, you're telling yourself and the other person, ideally, that there's ways we can equivocate and mislead ourselves and conceal, but a lot of times if you set the setting correctly, you're going to tell what is most important to you. And like what happened to me during this experience and something I'm learning how to do, and this is also something they talk about in therapeutic language, but I've read about it, I've just never been able to access it, is we talked about certain things, and those things, my system, my body flagged for pain.
Right.
So there was different types of the conversation, there was different pain in different parts of my body, and that pain is a signal about what thing needs to rise in a hierarchy of attention.
Right.
And most of the time, if it's gotten to the level where my body has to give me pain for it, that means I've suppressed it for a very long time because I don't want to feel it.
Right.
And this is why I really advocate. It's tricky to advocate certain things because there's always the problem of outliers. But to say something like I advocate therapy from a therapist comes with the caveat that sometimes there's not good therapists and therapy isn't for everybody. But in general, let's say if someone is able to do their due diligence, I recommend therapy for most people, whether have the kind of issues that we have or don't.
I remember when my first therapist told me after seeing him for a very long time that I didn't need therapy anymore.
Interesting.
And he was getting ready to retire.
Yeah.
And, and I started to really realize that I might not need therapy for the same reasons that I needed the day I arrived.
Right.
But now I need therapy to navigate my way through what's next.
Yeah.
Right? You know what I mean? Like, and that's the reason why this exists too.
Yeah.
It's an additional sounding board to be able to work through thoughts, ideas, and other things. Some conclusions you'd like to be able to come to in your head, but they really come through. It's just a conversation, right? You know what I mean? Like this. And so, you know what I mean? It's the reason why, in that last conversation I had with my therapist, and, we talked about this show specifically, why it really came out, why it should continue, because it's beneficial to the parties that are involved that participate.
Yeah.
It's also, in some ways, could serve to be beneficial to others because it can basically serve as an example to others the power that comes through vulnerability.
Absolutely.
That Brene Brown shit, baby.
Yeah.
That's what's up. You know what I mean? I'm down with Brene.
Yeah.
Right? And, and her whole, concept of, the strength and the power that comes through vulnerability, I've embraced and just kind of took. And I went from somebody that would never really show you, the deep down soft side of me to realizing that, I can do that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And there's strength and power in that. So, I mean, this is a fucking dynamite conversation. You know what I mean? I don't think it's the last one you and I will have, if that makes sense. Yeah. And I feel like, we, in recovery, it's kind of like we pass each other in the halls.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, when we're in school, you know what I mean? You're like, hey, what's up? But when I see you now and I say, hey, what's up?
It's going to be different.
Definitely different.
Yeah.
So I appreciate you, brother. I'm going to get that fist pound that we do at the end of every Dancing on a Volcano episode, my brother. Thank you so much. I appreciate you coming out. Thank you for sharing with us. And, Dancing on a Volcano. That's another one in the can. See you on the next show. Love you guys. Tuning out.